Hello, you are now entering the infinite void. Hang on tight. We cannot save you now.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode. I'm your co-host Matty.
And I'm your co-host Jacob, and today's episode we are discussing part 3 and our final episode of the series on simulation theory, and it's basically just going to be like final thoughts, opinions, what we think about it, and just more of a general discussion, I think, which would be good after we kind of went through all of the crazy theory behind it.
So if anyone's not checked out parts 1 and 2, in part 1 we just sort of looked at some of the history and the general outline of what simulation theory was, and then last time we focused more on the technology and what a simulation could be. And I think we got sidetracked a bit, but as we usually do.
Yeah.
But yeah.
No, yeah, and I think it'd be good for our listeners to kind of see where our ideology and kind of stuff aligns a little bit, because we're in episode 26 now, I think, and we don't really give our opinion that much, so it'll be quite fun to do that, I think.
Yeah. Do you want to put cards on the table now, or save that to the end?
We can kind of... I don't know. We can... I want to, like, reference a few things before I say, actually, so I think that's probably...
Okay. Let's start with what you've sort of been researching, and then some of the notes you have, and then we'll kick off with that.
Cool. So I kind of just wanted to start it with the Nick Bostrom stuff that we discussed with his simulation argument. I think that he proposed back in 2003. But it's funny because I think a lot of listeners are already going to kind of know where I align on this, or they might be surprised by my outcome or my opinion on it. But I think what he kind of proposes with his kind of like 3 different outcomes, I think are quite important in kind of giving the side of it is a simulation like a good argument, if that makes sense. So obviously with the first one, we've got the fraction of human level civilizations that reach a post-human stage. Number 2, the fraction of post-human civilizations that are interested in running simulations of their own evolutionary history or variants of that. And then 3, the fraction of all people with all kinds of experiments that are living in a simulation is very close to 1. And when we were talking about this, and you were kind of saying how if everybody, like what would be the purpose in having multiple simulations, and if people would be interested in them. I found that quite interesting because prior to doing this episode, I'd kind of always just thought about it as this kind of thing where it's like, oh, could be a simulation. Do you know what I mean? Like, oh, it's just a simulation another day kind of thing in the simulation from watching like the Truman Show and stuff like that. But when we actually started discussing it, I found that aspect of it really interesting with this whole idea of like how interested we are in doing simulations. I think that's has to mean something towards this argument, even if it's just a philosophical standpoint, because we would totally make simulations for this very reason if we had the power to do it. And I guess sometimes you don't always know like the full picture until you see it. Do you know what I mean? Like you can see with like your favorite example, particle physics, they're always forever changing what that model looks like. Do you know what I mean? There's never like a final picture. And it might be easy for one person to say, yeah, but we can't, like you physically can't with like computer power and stuff. But I think we might not know everything too. But that's not me saying that it is a simulation. I found that part of the research quite interesting, this idea that like, would anyone want to simulate it? And I think just going off us, I can imagine any intelligent life is probably curious, but that also might be a very naive thing to say.
Yeah, I think the Nick Bostrom stuff's really interesting, and that idea of just these sort of 3 simple concepts, because I think I was like you when thinking about this stuff. It was like an interesting thing to think about. It was like, oh, it's sort of like an intangible thing. Oh, we never know. We can't ever know. But when you think about those 3 points that Nick Bostrom put forward, they're sort of very clear, like intersections, and you can choose which way you go on them. And it's odd that I don't think, will humans reach like a very high level of technology? I think that's probably the most difficult question to answer.
Yeah.
I think it's really hard because there's this sort of, when thinking about sort of economics and things, if you try to guess like how long a company will be around for, you only have like history to base it on. So like as a very, very rough approximation, people say, oh, you should sort of imagine that you're completely average and you're just in the middle. So a company that's been around for 100 years probably will be around in 100 more years.
Yeah.
A company that's only been around for 5 years, you should only expect to be around for another 5 years. Now, of course, that's not true, and it's this sort of paradox of like, well, if you'd have said that about a company that's been around for 100 years, 95 years ago, you wouldn't think it would still be around. But, modern humans have been around for 2, 3, 4,000 years or something. We should expect humans to be around in 2, 3, 4,000 years in the future.
Yeah.
And humans at that point, I think, probably would have a lot of these technologies that we talked about and the ability to make a sort of convincing simulation. So, but point one of Nick Bostrom's sort of trilemma, I'd say, is definitely the hardest one to answer, but I'm probably a bit quite optimistic that we will get to that point.
Yeah.
The second one, like we discussed with, would we be interested? I think that's, for me, a very clear yes. And then that brings you on to point 3 of, well, if you think that and you think that simulations are possible, then the logical conclusion is that we are in a simulation just based on like statistics. So it's quite interesting that sort of before this, I don't think I'd ever really, I'd obviously thought about it, but I'd never put a number on, oh, it's 1 in 100 or 1 in a million chance that we're in a simulation. Whereas Nick Bostrom's stuff, very, very quickly you arrive at either, no, simulations aren't possible, we're not in a simulation, or simulations are possible, we're in a simulation. So it's quite interesting.
Well, he goes on as well, doesn't he? And he kind of talks about this idea that like there's an argument more so that you're more likely to be a simulation than not a simulation from how many simulations could arise from the first one, which is quite funny. But no, I'd agree with you. I think it's really difficult, and I think we should probably just start getting into kind of our views, because it'll be easier to kind of go from there, because I'm kind of like jumping around little things here, looking at my notes, trying to decide what I should say now and what I shouldn't say. So do you want to kick it off, or?
So my overall view is, and it's something that I want to come back to you later about, if we are in a simulation or if we're not, should we be trying to find if we're in a simulation? What are the possible repercussions to that? So that's something that I want to come back later. So we'll bookmark that. My personal view on it is that I don't particularly care either way. I don't think it really impacts me. My heart says we're not in a simulation. I want to think that I'm a real person. Yeah. But the logical conclusion is that we probably are, and that's like really unnerving. Yeah. Cards on the table. I don't particularly care either way. I don't think it really impacts me. Heart, no. Head, probably yes.
Yeah, I think so. For me, I'm kind of on the same. Before we started doing all this research, I would always just joke around and be like, "Oh yeah, we live in a simulation." And if anything weird happened, or if I had like, I don't even know, just like some kind of weird occurrence, I'd be like, "Oh, that's the simulation," or good news or bad news kind of thing. But through doing this, I kind of realized that, like, because I think something that maybe doesn't get talked a lot about with simulation theory, which I found quite interesting, especially like on Reddit, it's quite a good route for people to go down that maybe aren't like super religious, just for like answers. And I found like maybe looking into this when I first started looking at it would like give me some of the answers to some of the philosophical like things that I was thinking of in my like day-to-day life, and it actually just gave me more questions and kind of scared me more. And I'm kind of like on your kind of like wavelength of this idea that like it doesn't really matter if it is or isn't, because there's nothing you can do to prove that it is or isn't. But then at the same time, it's also equally scared me, because then it just means like when you're not existing, what happens then? Like if you're not in the simulation, then you're like fully not around, because I'm interested in all of that kind of stuff. Do you know what I mean? I'm not talking about like afterlife and heaven and all that kind of stuff now, but just this idea of, I think simulation theories is good, but it also raises more questions, and it also scares me even more about like stuff that we have no idea about, because it's like you're saying, like the possibility of it being a simulation is quite high. So then what implications does that have for just the reality that we live in?
I think that sort of analogy to religion is actually pretty apt, and it is by most definitions very religious. You know, it's something that we can't really know and we're unsure of, and potentially sort of, you know, you can look at it as like, oh, this is like the meaning of everything, this is sort of what we're here for, this is everything. Or it could be like, oh, there's this higher power and we have no control over anything. So,
yeah.
And yeah, I think you can be scared by that or reassured by that. But yeah, I think there's a lot of sort of analogies that can be drawn to religion, and I'm not religious in any way, and I wouldn't fit. As I said, I'm not particularly bothered by this, and I wouldn't say that it impacts my life at all in the way I think about stuff even. But there is definitely that sort of aspect to it, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, no. Yeah, I didn't mean like I'm now terrified of dying. Anyone that's listening or anything like that. I was just thinking about it, and I was like, if we were going to take the full like picture, like what would be the purpose of reality being a simulation, and then what exists inside of the simulation and what exists outside of the simulation. But I did think it was quite interesting with like the ideology and like the philosophy behind it being so close to a religion, because I can also imagine like if you had a tech age back when like a tech boom back when like all of the religions were being created, I can imagine simulation theory would probably be a religion or a cult. Do you know what I mean? Because it's got the creator, it's got like something existing out of existence and stuff like that. So I find it interesting. But based off Nick Bostrom's kind of like argument for it being a simulation, I wrote some funny, well, not really funny, just some independent thoughts that I had about it on if it was a simulation, what some of the things could possibly be. So prepare to have your mind blown now, listeners. You're going to be able to fully see into Jake's head. So the first one would be comparable civilizations would produce a simulation to help the understanding of their own simulation. So they might find out that they're in a simulation and want to create simulations to see how the simulation could be simulated to end. So that was like one first argument for if there is, why we would do it. Number two, artificial intelligence could produce said simulations to help with extra space and computing power. And this kind of falls back to what me and you were talking about with like, is like consciousness just data processing aware of itself? You could make an argument that maybe like some super artificial intelligence would want to create simulations of consciousness to be able to like create loads of like cloud data banks for itself to run more stuff. And then the final one, which I thought was a little bit out there, but it kind of ties into last week with like the idea of like quantum computers and stuff. What happens if it's just all by accident? What happens if they were just fiddling with like their version of a quantum computer or something and they turned it on, and just them turning it on is what we see as the Big Bang? And we've done it to countless new simulations that we didn't know every time we just turn a piece of our tech on.
Yeah, that accidental thing was actually something I was thinking about, and I sort of came at it from the other side. Is that assume the universe is real, there is no reason for us to exist and for us to be doing this. Like,
Yeah.
this is accident upon accident, you know, through billions of years that have led to this moment. And like, there's no reason for us to be doing this. We just happen to be a collection of cells that have formed over millions of years doing this. And actually, in some ways, the simulation theory sort of solves that, in that there is a reason, and like there would be some reason for stuff to happen, and like the reason why you're here is just like that's what we've been programmed to do.
Yeah. It's so weird because like I find this subject can like take you both ways really quickly. Like you can get to the point where it's like, oh, I just don't care. Nothing like really matters. It's not going to affect me. You can also take the standpoint of being super far one way and just being like, well, if it's a simulation, like nothing matters. There's no free will. I don't have purpose. I'm just here to be a part of it. I can't escape it. Blah, 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 blah. And then you've also got the other side of it where that's just the answer to everything.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because, like, for me, when you're reading about, like, simulation theory, because it gets kind of thrown in a lot with a lot of other, like, ridiculous conspiracy theories and stuff like that. And like one of them, I don't know if you found this from doing research, but like a lot of research that I was doing, this simulation theory and flat Earth, the amount of times they were coming up together on YouTube, and I was like, that doesn't really make any sense because like we've proven, and I know if there's somebody that listens to this that is a flat Earth believer, I'm sorry that I'm about to destroy all of your dreams, but like we have proven that like the Earth isn't flat. Do you know what I mean? And it was like you're saying, there's no way of proving that we live in a simulation. So I don't understand where or why. It might just be me with what I was searching. But when I was searching simulation theory, a lot of the time, this one and flat Earth kept coming up together. And I was like, that makes no sense. Because like one, we've actively proven. And the other one, you can't prove. And that's kind of the whole point of why it's a theory.
Mm-hmm. I never really know what to make of conspiracy theorists, but it's hard to tell whether it's actually real or it's just people like trolling to the next level.
Yeah. But back on simulation theory, I think it's really interesting because it is like you're saying, like you can take it every single way, and then if you just go even like fully the other way and you're like, yes, everything is a simulation, but then why? Like, what is the point of it being a simulation? And like, I like what you were saying actually a minute ago about like what would be the implications in us finding out if it was a simulation too, because like if you were playing a game and then the character in the game found out it was in a game and then didn't want to play the game anymore, you'd probably just shut down the game.
Yeah, so this is what I wanted to talk about, and it's this idea of like, should we even be trying to find out if we're in a simulation, and then what would we do if we were? So there seems to be like a few different schools of thought. One is that basically what would happen if we found if there was a simulation, and most, like you said, there's this sort of like idea that we would just be turned off, you know, whether that's because we're in a simulation and we don't want to do it anymore, so they just shut us off, or, you know, they're trying to maybe replicate some civilization, and then once we've become aware of it, we're no longer useful because we're not, you know, a control group or something. They shut us off for that. So there's lots of things you can think about and sort of hypotheticals about what could or couldn't happen, but most of them seem to end with us being turned off. is the bottom line. So then, in terms of like, should we be looking? Should we be trying to find this? Some people are very much on the sort of side of, well, this is the answer to everything. You know, we should be putting absolutely all of our resources into this. You know, from a like existential, philosophical point of view, this is the answer to are we real? What is the point of life? Every question you could think of is contained within this. We should be putting absolutely everything into this. But for those sort of like philosophical reasons, but also practical reasons of we should, if we find out we're not in a simulation, great, we can carry on with our lives. If we are in a simulation, we want to make our lives as interesting as possible so that we don't get turned off. And then there's some other people sort of are very much on the side of, well, if we find out we're in a simulation, there's a very good chance we will be turned off. So why don't we just carry on doing what we're doing and trying to be good and do interesting things? So on the off chance that we are, we don't get turned off and we just carry on as we are in the meantime. So I think you could sort of look at it both ways. And people seem to have quite strong views on this.
Yeah, I can imagine like you could like mess yourself up with that one as well, because you could just end up going through your whole life being scared that you're in one but not wanting to find out just in case you get turned off. And then the other aspect of it is like doing everything because you want to experience it, because you've got the cheat codes and you don't want to have a waste of an existence.
Yeah, and that's sort of the, like I said, with me not particularly caring, that's the sort of mindset I would take of, is that whether we are a simulation or not, the best course of action is that we don't pay any particular attention, and we just try to do stuff that would, doing science and producing culture and exploring space. These are things that surely are going to keep us turned on for longer, even if we are a simulation. So let's just do more of that. And if we're not a simulation, we have a better time of it anyway. So.
I think that's a good outlook to have. And as well, like, you go and do something, like if you, I don't know, throw a apple pie at a stranger in the street because it's a simulation, you're still going to be done in the simulation for your crimes and for like what you've done. So I'd agree with you. I feel like it's a fun conversation to like talk about, because you can literally go off in all directions with it. And living in like the technology age that we live in, it's obviously quite a fun thing to talk about because it has so many different avenues and like so many different things to build on it. But I think when it comes down to it, it's one of those like topics where it can like only go so far, because we're never going to know. And if we do find out, it's going to render the conversation pointless in the first place. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think as well with like finding out is when we were talking about the allegory of the cave. If someone managed to like escape the cave and then came back, or if they like had a glimpse out of the cave, would they even recognize that as real, or would they just think, oh, that's something outside of my existence, that's obviously not real? If I was walking along in the street one day and a Windows message popped up that said, you are in a simulation, press here to exit, like, would I even think that was real? Probably not. So like, and actually that's like another point of people in, as I said, so I'm very much in the camp of like, I don't particularly care, we shouldn't try to care. People who think we should be putting a lot of effort into this and usually fall into a sort of mindset as like, we should try and escape the simulation. That's the sort of, seems to be their end goal. And I wonder what, first, like, what do you think about this idea of trying to escape the simulation?
Well, my first question would be like, can you? Like, can matter exist outside of the thing that's simulating the matter? So that would be like my first question, because I used to like really have a tough time with this as a kid, like trying to imagine what nothing was. And I don't know if I'm just a weird kid, but when I used to like sit there and be like, so what's outside of space? Because that was always my question. And they'd be like, well, nothing. It's like space, or there was nothing and then there was everything. It's like, well, what does nothing look like? And that used to like really freak me out. So like off the bat, I'd say, I don't think you can, and what would be the purpose of escaping. But then I guess it also depends on the person that's making that argument, are they? Because if they don't know a lot, it's quite normal for like a human to think the grass is greener. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And like, I could see like a quite good Hail Mary of just being like, well, utopia exists outside the simulation, so let's all just escape it. But what if the simulation was also created because base reality sucks, and they made a simulation to make it better, and we spend our entire existence escaping it, and then it's like horrible.
Yeah, I think this point comes back to like what the simulation is, because I think that answer of like, should we try and escape, is quite clear if we're thinking that base reality is, you know, some computer lab and they've got a computer running and we are in that, you know, there doesn't seem to be any real way that we could escape. Would there be any point, you know, would base reality just be similar to ours? Would it be, you know, us just in a lab sort of thing?
Yeah.
But then this comes back to ideas of what if the simulation is sort of a brain in a jar, or is sort of like a Matrix thing where we'll lay down having dreams, and like the simulation is that. And this idea of like escaping would be us going from this to us going to, because in that case, space reality would presumably be some massively technologically advanced, futuristic utopia / dystopia. You know, so if I could like flick my fingers now and wake up, pulling myself out of the simulation, and wake up in the year 4000 where everything's amazing, then there is a potential sort of a feasible way of us existing outside of the simulation, because that will be real us. Yeah. And it being good. So I sort of do understand the argument, but again, I'm just here for, this is the hand I've been given. This is what I'm going to do with
it. Actually, that's a good point, because my next question would be like, because I was taking it from, I don't know why I was picturing it like this in my head, but I was imagining it like a vacuum bag, when we're just in the vacuum bag, and like if you escape the vacuum bag, is there a bigger reality that bag exists in? But then I was thinking like, that probably wouldn't even be the case, would it? Because the simulation could just be simulating the space for the simulation too. Like you might not fall out of the back of a laptop and be like giant humans everywhere and be like, oh my God. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I don't know. I don't, but I agree with you though too. I can see the appeal in escaping the simulation, but I think that also just comes down to humans longing to explore, because we've always liked to do that. And it's like fractally with everything, isn't it? Like you could shrink the escaping the simulation argument down to like 500 years ago, somebody escaping the island and making an argument for why he thinks there might be other islands. Do you know what I mean? And everyone being like, you're crazy. So I can see why people would feel that way, but I just don't see if it's even feasible.
I think what would be really, and obviously this is a long way off, but what would be really interesting is if we got to a point where we could create a simulation and we could upload ourselves into it. So we've sort of discussed this a bit in the past, and I think we even discussed whether we would do it. You know, you've got a computer in front of you which is running, you know, an amazing version of The Sims. Everything is great. It all looks awesome, and you can step into a machine and your consciousness and you would be put into the simulation. That opens up a very real question, because if we can do it here and we can put ourselves into the simulation, what if we are the simulation and we can go up one level? that is interesting, because then you've got like first-hand knowledge of like, this is possible, or at least seems possible.
Yeah.
So I think obviously that's a long way away, but that would be awesome.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Well, figuring it out is effectively like getting cheat codes to a game, isn't it? Like you can just instantly have everything you want. You want your wormholes, there you go. You want your crazy warp drive. There you go. But yeah, no, that's a good point. Maybe, here you go. Here's a crazy idea. Maybe all these like UFO sightings and stuff like that, they aren't actually UFOs. They're just people in the simulation. Maybe it's just them like plugging in for a minute, coming in just to check on what we're doing because we've like done something that the simulation's like flagged. They've gone, this doesn't usually happen. So they have to like jump in quick and just check, be like, oh, we'll just iron that piece of code out and then we'll go back to normal. But maybe as well, because I was thinking about this, like what would be the purpose in having a simulation? Especially like the conscious aspect of it, because when we discussed in that episode about like why simulations are good, there's obviously millions of reasons on why we would have a simulation and why it would be good to simulate reality. But the bit that I struggle with is like why we would simulate the conscious bit of reality, because like we'd obviously want to do it for history, or we'd want to do it to find out what has happened. So like we'd simulate a solar system to see what happened to the planets, or a galaxy to see how far the species spread across the stars and stuff. But I was thinking like if you could simulate consciousness, then would there be a need for a simulation because you could just simulate consciousness in base reality? Like you could give yourself any kind of thought or feeling, so there would be no need to create the simulation to house the thought or feeling. So then I was thinking like what would be the point in the consciousness aspect of the simulation? But then I guess it would be, well, the simulation is there for consciousness to kind of like play with. Do you know what I mean? But maybe that's what it is. Maybe if you go like back kind of well far now, like brains in a jar, and like when people say like, oh, maybe the universe is a being and everything in it is the universe kind of thing. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe like consciousness exists as beings. I don't know, like all conscious humans do, and then they have a universe to like experience in. I don't know, but then what would be the point in that? That's also implying that they know what happens to consciousness and where it comes from and where it goes.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? I think, you know, personally, I why would we simulate consciousness? I think that's quite a simple answer. Of like, you know, you would want to simulate a family member or something that you've never got to meet, or you know, you're running a simulated world and you want to test people's morals and ethics in different situations. You know, that would, you know, again, consciousness mightn't necessarily be required for that, but it would surely help if you're trying to run a simulation to see how people would react in a crisis, or how people would react to you know, some certain event. Having conscious creatures making conscious decisions inside of that would be more lucrative, you know, as a research experiment than having just sort of non-conscious people going around. So I think that's sort of part of it, is that I don't think consciousness is required to make a good simulation, but it will give you more tools to create stuff. And, you know, assuming we're real, conscious humans appear to be, you know, conscious humans are a part of Earth and a part of, you know, society. Well, they're responsible for society and things. If you want to simulate any of that, then a good place to start would be having conscious things in that simulation to do that, I think.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Okay then, what about this for a question? Can you break the simulation? Because, not that you'd want to, but also thinking about it, like we were saying, like it would take an unfathomable amount of computing power to create a simulation of the universe. And now I can imagine on top of that, like the computing power to simulate every conscious being. I can imagine the longer we go into the future, there's going to be more and 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 more in life, right? Mm-hmm. Probably to the point where it's like 1 billion times more living things in the universe than there are right now. Mm. Does that mean eventually that because the simulation is already, like, if it is a simulation, it would already be operating at like its limits? If it just keeps expanding and life keeps cropping up everywhere, is it just going to start crashing in places? Or would that be a way to like try and break it? Because we've obviously discussed, is it a simulation and does it matter? And then we've discussed like trying to escape it, but could you break it?
I've just thought about this now, that maybe, this is a potential answer to the Fermi paradox of, if I was going to, I've made a simulation, it's working all good, Earth's great. I don't want them to mess it up. I don't want them to sort of generate so much stuff that it crashes. The very first thing that I would do is put like a box around Earth or a box around the solar system, and say outside of that we're not interested. We just simulate some stars on like the edges of the box on the sky box, and that would explain why there's no other life. Is that it's coded in that there's nothing outside of it. So
can you imagine actually if that's like the case? Like there's this giant maze on all these planets that have got life, and when they get to a certain level, like the walls just lift, and it's like right, they're like at a point in their evolutionary like scale that now they are allowed to like go out there. They're not going to damage everything around them. There can be no cross contamination. They understand. Because that's a good point. I think I've often thought like the whole idea for like simulation theory is a good argument for the Fermi paradox. It's also a good argument for the great filter in the idea, and that's also why we might not see anyone, because it might just be easier to simulate a reality on your planet than actually using the resources of your reality.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, it does sort of. This goes back to sort of how simulation theory could tie into sort of physics and stuff. Is that if you were going to make a simulation, you would presumably have to think about trying to manage computing resources. It's not. It seems unlikely that computing resources could be infinite. The very first things that I would do is, I would set render distances so that we can't see beyond stuff. I'd put sort of physical limits on things, which would be, you can't see any smaller than that, which we seem to have in our universe with like the Planck length and things. I would put sort of limits on the time that things are around, so that after a while, complex objects like suns and solar systems just sort of disappear and go away. So, and this is what a lot of people argue, is that a lot of the universe does seem to be computery. It does seem to be like someone has sat there, thought, how can I solve this problem? I'll code it to do this, and that's what it seems to do. And that's sort of an argument for the simulation theory. So yeah, I think I don't think we'll ever know, and I don't think there is any way to know, and that's fine by me.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. I think I'd agree with you. I don't really know where else you can kind of take it after that, because it's like you're saying, there's no real way of finding out, and unless somebody like shows up and it's like, this is a simulation or it's not a simulation, you kind of just need to carry on living your life as usual. And even if somebody does show up and says this is a simulation or this isn't a simulation, it's not, I don't think it's really going to change anything.
No.
But I think it will be interesting, like watching the coming decades with what we do with simulations and what we do with our computing power, because I think this topic could be a very interesting one in the future, depending on if we start having breakthroughs with certain things that we've discussed with like games and simulations, and like is it ethical? Like if we start having those conversations and we start like simulating consciousness and stuff, We probably have to do a part 4 and be like, we were wrong. But should we move on to some news then and
yeah, I think that's
call it there?
Leave it.
Yeah, because it's pretty heavy, and I think you could probably send yourself crazy with this topic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
have an existential crisis. But yeah, do you want to kick off the news, or do you want me to kick off the news this week?
I'll start, I guess. I'll start with because I know we both had this bit of news. So in science, is the news that scientists at the Large Hadron Collider think they may have found something that indicates physics beyond the standard model. So this is in particle physics. They think they've got sort of evidence, not confirmed yet, but it looks quite promising that they found particles beyond the standard model.
Yeah, sorry, I was just loading up the article. Yeah, yeah, it's pretty crazy. From the thing that I was reading on Science Focus when it loads.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they were saying here that it's too early to say, but no, hang on, I've got an ad. But yeah, no, yeah, they were just talking about bottom quarks, and they were saying how it's too early to say yet, but it suggests something through muons of decay. I was going to ask you because I don't know what any of this really means. I kind of drew a line at like neutrons, electrons, and protons. So,
well, the again, I will prefix this by saying I know very little about particle physics, as I always do. But essentially, the Large Hadron Collider, they've been studying these beauty quarks, and they do something to it. And I've not even attempted to read the actual paper on this. I've just looked at these articles, but they're looking at these beauty quarks and how it decays. And under the standard model, the sort of conservation laws dictate that it should produce electrons and muons, I think, was sort of what it should decay into. Yeah, electrons and muons, and that they should be equal in number. So for every one electron, you should have one muon. But actually, they've seen that you get a lot more electrons produced, and they're saying that is evidence for an as yet undiscovered particle called the leptoquark. So again, no real knowledge of what that is, but that would be a particle outside the standard model and would.
So another one.
Yeah, at the moment they're saying, so in physics we use 5 sigma as the sort of standard to rubber stamp stuff and say this is real, this is science. So all of science will have been tested to 5 sigma. At the moment the measurements are at 3 sigma, which means that it's a 1 in 1,000 chance that this is just a statistical error. So 1 in 1,000 is good. It's not good enough for physicists. So they are going to go back and I think probably repeat some stuff, go over the data and refine it. But this would be huge. This would be, if this turns out to be true, this would basically mean we rip up all of particle physics as we know it. We'd have to start again, effectively. So yeah, it's quite an exciting discovery that they seem to be on the verge of making.
God, it's a proper heavy episode this week, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is. Yeah, in terms of physics, things don't get much bigger than this. This is sort of rip out the book and start again kind of physics.
Yeah.
So it's going to be interesting to see what they do next and if they do manage to prove this.
It will be interesting for sure. Well, does that mean that would it change like everything?
Potentially. In terms of the fundamental facts, it would most likely change everything. It's in the same way that our Newtonian gravity. We know Newtonian gravity. so Newton's laws of sort of motion and stuff are false. They're not true. We know that, sort of quantum mechanics and not quantum, general relativity goes beyond that, and general relativity does a better job of describing the universe than Newtonian mechanics. So and this is the thing with physics, is that very often things aren't true or false. We just try and describe stuff. So Newtonian mechanics is wrong. We know it's wrong, but for everyday stuff, it's good enough. Yeah. If you want to do stuff beyond that, you have to use relativity. And if you start to go to the edges of that, we know that that's wrong, and that there's stuff that we have to sort of improve upon. So I think it will probably be a similar case of that, for what we teach kids in schools and for what we need to know, and, understanding stuff around static electricity and how your phone charges and stuff, your electrons, your quarks, your basic bosons, they're going to be fine. You don't have to worry about it. But in terms of actually what is true, again, nothing is fully true, but what is the fundamental facts? This will be start again, develop a better idea. So yeah, it's gonna be cool if it turns out to be not an error in the data.
No, that sounds cool. Right, so for my bit of news this week, today, I think, as we're recording this on a Wednesday the 24th, but scientists have released another photo of the first picture that we got of a black hole, but this time it's showing it in polarized light. Now, I don't know if you've just loaded this up, Matty, but it looks really cool. They're basically showing like the magnetic kind of like lines and torsion on it. But it basically says this in turn allows scientists to measure the polarization and understanding how magnetic fields operate so close to a black hole. But it looks very interesting, and the photos look beautiful. They kind of look exactly the same as the simulate, like, the original simulated animations of what they thought a black hole was going to look like.
Yeah, so I'm looking at it now. So again, astronomy, like particle physics, is not what I do. But if anyone knows these sort of original images, that sort of orange donut shape, it's effectively that, but then it's got a swirl on it. So the polarized light will mean that the light in that image is subject to polarization from the magnetic field. So in the same way that you can shine light through a sort of polarized on Earth, and see how it sort of twists, that's what's happening here. And this is going to be interesting because sort of our understanding of black holes is very much that they sort of spin around, and obviously in conventional magnetics and electromagnetics, spinning things very often are exciting and do stuff. So if you have something like a black hole spinning and producing magnetic fields, then that's going to be interesting, and it'd be cool to see what they do with this, and whether they're able to do this on other things in the future.
Have you seen those images of like galaxies that have got the magnetic lines in them? They look so cool.
No,
I think NASA put up a couple not that long ago on social media, but they just look really cool. They're all like knotted and twisting around each other and stuff, and it's just the magnetic fields of the galaxy. But I've always, bit off topic, but I've always seen that first image of a black hole like a lit cigarette from far away.
Yeah, that's true.
It looks like the end of a cigarette. I don't know where I saw it, but I saw a meme ages ago when it first came out, and it was like first image of a black hole. And then it just zoomed out, and what somebody had done is they'd photoshopped that image of a black hole at the end of like one of Snoop Dogg's like things, and it was just standing there, and it's like, wow, you've really done that to something that is like a crazy science discovery. But no, it looks cool, and anybody listening, you should go and check it out. I'll put all of the news articles in the show notes if you want to go and check this. But it looks cool. It's very pretty.
Mm-hmm. Everyone likes pretty pictures of space stuff.
Exactly. They always do well on the socials.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think you've got one more thing, haven't you?
Yeah, so this one is quite big. There's a lot of stuff in this if you've not yet opened it up. So basically NASA has just announced their new the projects that they're going to receive their NASA Innovative Advanced Concepts grants. So this is the program run by NASA where they basically give money to groups, usually sort of research groups, to investigate cool stuff. And this is sort of NASA's R&D arm trying to push the boundaries of space science. So it says here, phase one, you'll get $125,000. Phase two, generally up to $500,000, and phase three is $2 million. So quite a lot of money for these sort of small, medium-sized companies and groups and university research groups to use. And there's a big list of things in this article. So this is on space.com, NASA Innovative Advanced Concepts Projects. There's a list of maybe 20 or so on here projects, and I've just sort of got a few of the more interesting ones. So autonomous robotic demonstrator for deep drilling. So this is from Planet Enterprise. They are going to be looking at autonomous drilling systems that could utilize something like Perseverance to do deep drilling, so boreholes on other planets. That obviously goes into things like mining and looking at subsurface physics on other planets. Sensing with independent micro swimmers. So this is a JPL project that's going to look to develop these micro swimming robotics that could be used on something like Europa to look for biology on watery planets and moons. And one more that I picked out was where is it? No. Ablative arc mining for in situ resource utilization. This is a team from the University of Texas, El Paso. They're going to look at extracting and collecting water with other sort of minerals and materials by ablating the surface using electric arcs, which creates free ionized particles that can be sorted by mass into material groups. So again, this goes back to mining opportunities and also generating water and materials on other planets for colonies, I presume. So I'd suggest anyone go and have a look at this. There's a lot of interesting projects on here, and of course it's great that NASA are funding cutting edge science and space tech.
Yeah, I'm just looking at it now, and that one's just caught my eye, the Titan sample return one.
Yeah.
I'm well excited for when we send something to Titan and Europa. I can't wait.
That's going to be awesome.
It is. It's going to be when we actually get like photos on the surface of moons from our gas giants. It's going to be crazy.
Mm-hmm.
I want to see the first human selfie on Mars, and then I want to see some surface photos from whichever robots we send to the surfaces of those moons, because it's going to be crazy. But yeah, there's some really cool stuff on here.
Yeah. I think what's interesting to me is the sort of like breadth that NASA has and what they do, because I think really in the news and the stuff that grabs the headline is massive rockets and rovers on Mars. That's it really. That's all most people sort of look about. But NASA does a lot of sort of space science and these sort of smaller but important missions, and a lot of the groundwork that companies build on. So stuff like the mining and resources, eventually it will probably be private companies that do that, but it's nice to see NASA exploring some of that and laying the groundwork for future years.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. It's very cool. That's pretty much it then for the news. But yeah, guys, if you enjoyed this episode, Make sure you give us a like if you're watching on YouTube, or if you're listening, go and give us a nice review, because it always helps us with the charting and everything. If you have any questions or you want to hit us up on social media, it's at Infinite Void Pod, and the email is theinfinitevoidpodcast@gmail.com if you want to suggest a topic or you've got a bit more of a lengthy question. You can also hit me up at Jacob E. Carson and Matty at the Matty JMP on Twitter. And yeah, guys, that has been Simulation Theory. Hope you guys have enjoyed this one and we haven't burnt you out too much. Keep an eye out on socials for what the next episode's going to be, and I'm sure we'll be putting up a poll soon as well for what the next series will be as well. So keep an eye out for that. And yeah, guys, hope you've enjoyed it, and we will catch you in the Infinite Void next week. Hey everyone, we wanted to take a moment to tell you about our brand new Patreon page.
Yeah, so we've devised a load of new goodies that are neatly packaged across 3 different tiers for you.
Tiers start at £3 and go all the way up to £10 a month.
Just to say, the Patreon is in no way an obligation, and we're going to continue making the podcast as it is freely available across all the platforms. But if you'd like to support us and show your support, you can now.
So yeah, head over to patreon.com/Infinite Void Pod for more information.